Ladies and gentlemen, now that the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz is being put in place by the president, Iran has lost complete control of the situation. And if you've been paying close enough attention, something has become evidently clear about what the president is doing. And it has to do with China, who is very upset right now. And so we got to break it all down. As always, you enjoy the content, smash that thumbs up. That's the best way to let me know. Subscribe to stay locked in with the future videos. Let's get right into it.
The blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, it's underway. U.S. Central Command issuing a note warning the blockade applies to all vessel traffic, regardless of the flag. And they write this: any vessel entering or departing the blockaded area without authorization is subject to interception, diversion, and capture. The blockade will not impede neutral transit passage through the Strait of Hormuz to or from non-Iranian destinations. So everybody's clear on where everything stands.
And so Iran thought that they would be able to charge a toll to whoever passes through the Strait of Hormuz and reportedly had them pay the toll in Chinese yen. Now, I just want you to stop and think about how insane that is. You got one of the most important global choke points on the planet being treated like a toll road for extortion. And that's the simplest explanation, ladies and gentlemen, for why the naval blockade was very necessary. Because you cannot let a critical trade route that affects the entire world be held hostage by a regime trying to squeeze everybody for leverage. But Trump has now taken it a step further. He's basically saying if Iran wants to play this game and close the strait, then fine. Let's really close it and flip that pressure right back on them. In other words, take Iran's biggest bargaining chip and turn it on its head. And that's where this becomes a much more strategic move, because now this is not just about Iran. This is also about China. Trump even pointed out that China has other options like, hey, come into the U.S. to buy their oil and gas, ladies and gentlemen. And China can buy from Venezuela too. And once you look at it that way, this whole strategy starts to make a lot more sense as far as the moves Trump has been making. Because this is not just about stopping Iran from using Hormuz as blackmail. It's also about forcing China to adjust, forcing China to feel the pressure, and making that Iran-China setup a whole lot less comfortable than it was before. Now, with that in mind, take a listen to this.
As far as China is concerned, China can send their ships to us. China can send their ships to Venezuela. We told them, buy from Venezuela. We have a lot of overcapacity. We'd sell them, and we'll probably sell it for even less money. I have a very good relationship with President Xi of China. We work together very well. They're paying us substantial money, as you know. We've never got money before. You know, I listened to this Gordon Chang. He has no idea what he's talking about. We have been very tough on China. Tough but fair. And, you know, it's an amazing place. But I have a very good relationship with China, and they've been during my, you know, I put tremendous tariffs. I put 100% tariff on all Chinese cars coming in, and that's destroying Europe. They're destroying Europe because they're taking away so much business from Mercedes and BMW, et cetera. And we don't have any Chinese cars in our country because they would have destroyed General Motors, Ford. They would have destroyed these companies if they did it.
And so while you have Trump there sounding friendly towards China in public, pay attention to his actual moves. He's been steadily raising the pressure on Beijing from multiple directions. Over the last 14 months, Trump's geopolitical moves in places like Venezuela, Cuba, Panama, Colombia, and even Europe have all added up to one thing: more pressure on the CCP's position in the global economy, crippling the Chinese economy by slowing exports and raising cost pressure. So Trump keeps making moves that makes China's position harder, riskier, and more expensive. And if you thought the China angle stopped at oil, that's where this story gets even more serious, because up to this point, you could at least make the argument that China was just looking out for its energy interests, just trying to protect access to Iranian crude, just trying to keep Hormuz from turning into an economic nightmare for its own economy. But now there's reporting that suggests this may be going beyond oil and beyond trade. Several verified reports indicate that China is preparing to provide Iran with air defense systems in a matter of weeks. And so if this intelligence is accurate, ladies and gentlemen, then this is not just China buying oil from Iran anymore. This is China potentially helping Iran stay in the fight while America is trying to squeeze it economically. And if that's the case, then Trump's move on the Strait of Hormuz is not just a pressure play on Iran, it's a test for China too. Take a listen to this.
In just a few hours, the U.S. blockade on the Strait of Hormuz goes into effect. Meanwhile, President Trump making it clear to another adversary, China, about the consequences if they play ball with Iran.
I hear news reports about China giving the shoulder missiles, what's called a shoulder missile, anti-aircraft missile. I doubt they would do that because I have a relationship, and I think they wouldn't do that. But maybe they did a little bit at the beginning, but I don't think they would anymore. No. But if we catch them doing that, they get a 50% tariff, which is that's a staggering amount.
This is the part where Iran's bluff starts to run into reality, because talking about controlling the strait is one thing. Actually controlling it when the U.S. Navy starts moving destroyers and setting the conditions to clear the route, that's something else entirely. As has been reported, with 2 American destroyers already entering the Strait of Hormuz as part of an effort, which means the U.S. is no longer just responding with words, is moving to challenge Iran's leverage in real time.
Persian Gulf, also known as the Arabian Gulf, which is what the president referred to it in that Truth Social posting that was just recently made. This is what happened on Saturday. This is very important to understand, all right? While the peace talks are underway, the United States Navy sends 2 destroyers through the Strait of Hormuz. They can look for mines, they can test for mines, they can search for mines, and they can prove to international carriers that it might be a safe passage, no matter what the Iranians are claiming to say. So this is what Iran wants to happen, all right? They want the shipping to move further to the east. There's an island over here called Larak Island, L-A-R-A-K, and that's where they want to collect the tolls. That's where they want the shipping to do. But here's what the U.S. Navy did on Saturday. The USS Peterson coming through and the U.S. Murphy coming through this area where the Iranians had said this is a hazardous area. Both of them went through, and now we wait to see what Iran does next. Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, former...
So, ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. is clearing mines in the Strait of Hormuz because you cannot reopen a choke point safely if there is still a credible mine threat sitting in the water. This is also how Trump strips away the little leverage Iran had left. If tankers and shores and shipping companies think the lane is mine, they're either going to turn around, delay, or charge huge risk premiums, right? Or just pay the toll to Iran. But clearing the mines is how the U.S. starts taking the strait away from Iran as a tool of leverage. This is the real play. For Iran, the value of Hormuz was never just military. It was political and economic. If Iran could threaten the route, selectively allow passage, create fear in the market, and force the world to react, then Iran held leverage. But once the U.S. starts clearing hazards and establishing safe passage itself, that threat becomes less valuable. In other words, the U.S. is not just removing mines, it's removing the usefulness of Iran's mine threat. And that's exactly why Iran did not reopen the strait as soon as the ceasefire was put in place, because reopening it on normal terms would not have benefited them. Their leverage comes from keeping the route uncertain, restricted, and dangerous enough that the world still had to deal with them on their terms. The moment that leverage disappears, so does their biggest bargaining chip. That is why once the talks in Islamabad broke down, President Trump moved straight to the blockade, because the whole point was to cut off the leverage Iran thought it could still maintain after diplomacy stalled. And now we get to the part where this starts looking less like a standoff, ladies and gentlemen, and more like a countdown, as reports are coming out that within 2 weeks, Iran won't be able to store oil and will have permanent long-term damage to extracting it. But more importantly, what we're talking about is more of the economic impact it will have on the region. Take a listen.
Iran, and you point out that Iran's oil infrastructure faces permanent damage after just 13 days of a blockade. And crunching the numbers, you're saying the cost to the regime ultimately and collectively would be some $435 million a day. But this is essentially a staring contest, is it not, as to who will blink first and who can publicly at least withstand more pain? Why do you think that this blockade could even last as long as you say that it could? 2 weeks seems like a very long time.
Hi, thanks for having me. No, I mean, it is unclear how long this blockade is going to last, what U.S. governments and allies and partners how long they can sustain this blockade and how effective it would be. It's obvious that Iranian regime is going to really escalate now, whether through targeting the flow of commerce in the Strait of Hormuz or even going after some of these oil production facilities in the Gulf. So that's a possibility. Now, at the same time, the numbers that you laid out, Iran has about, $280 million a day of export that goes out of the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz. About $160 million in import that comes back a day. So you're cutting that out. And if that is not happening, then what's going to happen? Iran's going to have to store its oil that is extracting on offshore storage facilities or on tankers. And, I think within 13, 14, 2 weeks, Iran's going to run out of the ability to store oil. And then they're going to have to drop their extraction, which is going to pose a permanent long-term damage to its ability to extract oil. And that can lead into some kind of a friction within National Iranian Oil Tanker Company, National Iranian Oil Company, labor strikes. And as a matter of fact, it's the regime's ability to pay salaries of its government employees. If they can't collect taxes because they can't sell metals, they can't sell petrochemicals and petroleum because they can't produce any, that is going to really hurt them really bad. We can also account for regime's ability to continue paying salaries.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why this move matters so much, because this is not just about ships in the water. It's not just about Iran talking tough. It's not just about Trump wanting a headline. This is about leverage, who has it, who's losing it, and who's being forced to deal with the consequences now. Iran thought Hormuz was its ace in the hole. It thought it could sit on one of the most important choke points in the world, threaten the route, selectively allow passage, squeeze the market, and force everybody else to react on their terms. But Trump's move is aimed at flipping that whole equation, and if the U.S. can clear the hazards, secure the route, block Iran's linked exports, and make the Strait less useful as a pressure weapon, then Iran's greatest strength starts turning into its greatest weakness. And that is where the China angle matters too, because this is not just Iran getting squeezed. China was the main outside buyer of Iranian oil. China has every reason to want that relationship to stay comfortable. And now Trump is making that setup more expensive, more unstable, and a whole lot less reliable. And instability in Hormuz starts pushing more ships to come get oil and gas from America. And that's not a loss for us. That's points on the board. That means more demand coming here, more strategic value coming here, more leverage coming here. In other words, while Iran is trying to weaponize a global choke point, Trump is trying to turn that chaos into an advantage for the United States by making American energy the safer and more reliable alternative. But those are my thoughts in the update. Now let me hear from you. As always, smash that thumbs up button. That's the best way to let me know. Subscribe to stay locked in with the future videos. And as always, until next time.